Hey, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer. Thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And today you are going to want to pay attention if you like pattern hacking or want to learn more about it, or if you have kids that like dinosaurs in your life. So this tutorial is all about how I create this dino toque off of the gnome hat pattern. So this is a Workshop Wednesday video that I've done. I'll put the link down in the description, and you can also get the pattern for it there. And then today we're going to hack that pattern and create this toque. So I was thoroughly disappointed this fall when my 4-year-old announced that this toque is no longer cool. And I've just been struggling all winter to, keep their necks warm. I don't like putting scarves on them because they're just 2 and 3. And my 3-year-old, of course, won't wear his gnome hat because the older brother doesn't. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to do dinosaur toques. Maybe they'll think those are cool enough. And still have the nice hooded hat that stays in place, doesn't come off, and keeps their neck warm. Like the original one does. So let's take a look at the pattern, what I needed to adjust to make this one. This is the free PDF gnome hat pattern that you can download. I'll put the link in the description box where you can go and get yourself a copy if you don't already have one. And then this is the pattern I made for the dino hat. So first of all, whenever I'm doing any type of pattern adjusting, pattern hacking, and teaching my students about pattern hacking, I always recommend that even once you're finished, you place them on each other and just see what has changed, what's different for this pattern as opposed to the original one. And I just had my 4-year-old slip on that original hat before he left for kindergarten today. And just to see what would I change if I wanted to change anything. And I decided, you know what, the opening for the hat could be a little bit smaller just so they can kind of pop it over their nose, mouth when it's a really cold day. And it's still stretchy enough that they can pull it down under their chin. I wanted to make the hat just slightly bigger for the head. So you can see here, if I flip it around this way, actually, let's flip it around, put this underneath here. Line that up, the face up. I trimmed off, of course, the little point for the gnome hat, but I also enlarged the head a little bit. So we have that coming down just a tiny bit. I only did this much because if we kind of look at this line, how it runs along the fold of the fabric, since this is a fold line, that's as much as we can kind of bring it down. I wanted to keep this corner at a right angle so we wouldn't have kind of a point on the forehead, a triangle. And then I just added a little bit to the top and a little bit to the back so it can the head can sit farther back in the hat and it won't need to stretch open. So the edge of the opening will be nice and close right by kind of the eyes and mouth, so the side of the head won't get as cold. And then I also lengthened it a little bit. So I didn't want to lengthen it the same amount along the entire bottom because that would mean that this kind of shoulder rounding is getting smaller and narrower. I just lengthened it on top of the shoulder and in the front and the back so that the two can stick into the jacket or at least overlap on the jacket nicely so there won't be cold drafts coming up underneath the hat. So here's my fabric, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the dino spikes first just because I have a relatively straight edge here. I'm going to fold it over so I can cut actually 4 layers at once, and then I'll have lots of spikes to work with. I'll need at least 1 row per hat. I was thinking maybe I would do a double row and do them offset. I don't know, we'll see how it looks once I get them together. And I'm going to just stitch them right sides together, 2 layers, flip it around, and then probably stuff it with a little bit of batting to give them more structure. So the first thing I'm doing here is just smoothing off the edge so that I have an even strip along the bottom. And then I'm going to put in markings every 2 inches because I've decided that's about the width I want each spike to have. So that's like 5 centimeters, 2 inches. I'm just going to mark along the whole edge. This is going to be much longer than I need it. And then I've got, of course, the 4 layers happening. So I'm going to have more than enough spikes, but I would rather cut them all out at once and have enough to go around. then have to go back and cut some more later. So now that I've smoothed this out, I'm going to just try cutting a spike, see what the size is. It's a little bit longer, like I don't think it needs to be so tall. So I'm gonna just go ahead and mark the center of this pre-prepped strip so I can gauge as I cut back and forth, and then I'm just gonna cut a zigzag line every 2 inches, creating 1 point back and forth, straight down the center. I am intentionally doing it freehand and a little raggedy because I want these spikes to have some character. I don't want them to be perfect. So here we go. I'm really liking the look of these spikes. I'm just gonna set them aside and then cut out the hat. So I have this fabric doubled over already, so I have 2 layers, and since I want to make 2 hats, I am going to lay my pattern on directly in the grain line. So this front edge, that's actually a fold line edge, I'm just going to make sure I have that centered really nice and straight up and down in the grain line, smooth everything out, and then I'm going to trace it, or cut it out rather. Once I have the first half cut out right to that fold line, I'm just going to flip my pattern over. I always like to mark it if I do it this way. Mark it so I know where the fold line should be and where my pattern, the straight edge of my pattern, should bump up against, just to make sure that I don't have one of the sides of the pattern kind of twisted or torqued in how it attaches. You do want to make sure it's nice and square to each other, but since I need 2 layers anyways, this just helps me cut those 2 layers and then on the outer edge. I could lay it on the fold, but then I would need to cut it out twice. This way I can get both hats in one go, and I can be really close to my selvage edge and leave that center for my next project. Now that I have the hood cut out in my fabric, I'm just going to fold it over and test out my spikes, see how they look on the hat here. Yep, looks like a dinosaur. I'm liking it. Now it's time to get the lining cut out. So I have this strip. It's just one side of a piece of fabric. I used half of it already, so I'm going to double it over on itself. It's pretty narrow. It's just a little more than my hat itself. And then I'm going to cut out the lining here as per usual, placing my pattern on the fold line and then cutting out one and then the other. I'm still cutting out 2 layers of fabric at once, so it's the same amount of work whether I cut it out this way or the way I previously did. It just fits better on my fabric pieces to do it this way, and then you can just see the two different options when you're cutting. Now that I have everything cut out, I'm just going to prep these spikes, and I've counted off 11 spikes. I've decided that that is the right amount. It goes pretty much along the whole top and then back seam of my hat, and I'm trimming it off in a way so that the first and last spike is just a little bit smaller. Then it kind of fades in and fades out, so I'm just going to line up these two sides and then trim it down and fade it out a little bit quicker just to shorten this first spike. And then I'm going to stitch it just with a straight lock stitch, so my regular machine, doing a straight stitch, because these spikes, they're not going to experience very much tug on the seam. They're going back and forth anyways, so even when they pull the hat on, it's not really going to get tugged. And this way I can do a really narrow seam allowance. I'm doing one cross stitch, so going up the point and then down the point, and then one straight stitch over the corner, both at the bottom and at the top. This just helps the points to turn really nicely when I get to that part of the process of turning all of these little points around. I'm just going to run down this whole strip and then we'll see how it looks. So before we flip these dino points around, I'm just going to snip off the points so that it's not as bulky. If I have a little more seam allowance on any particular points, I'll just trim the seam allowance as well. This will just help the points turn better and not be too much seam allowance on the inside to turn around. And then once I have all of those tips snipped off, I'm just going to go back and snip right here, right down to my stitching. So you want to be really careful you don't snip your stitching, but this will also just help the points turn better. Otherwise we'll get a pucker down in the corner here when it's trying to spread. So I'm just going to go through and snip all of those. Once all of my seam allowances are notched and trimmed, I'm just going to go ahead and turn these around, and since this is a really stretchy fabric, it turns so nicely. I can just slide my finger up into the point right up to the tip and flip it around, so it makes it super easy to get a nice sharp point at the top. And then it will depend what kind of fabric you're using on if you want to do this next step. But I also added just a little bit of fluff in the points. I wanted them to just have a little bit more stability. The tip is kind of nice the way it is, it doesn't really need any support because of the extra seam allowance. But as it gets down into the middle of the spike, it really gets softer. So I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna take a little bit of fluff here, a little bit of just a regular polyfill, and just stuff these out. I'm not going to put a whole lot in because I don't want them to shorten and get really round, but I do want them to just have a little bit more of stability, and I don't mind that tiny little bit of 3D shape all the way through. So just the tiniest little amount in these tiny points. Now that we have all the pieces cut out and our dino points prepped, I'm going to start by closing this face opening. So I'm going to use a 4-thread overlock on my serger. I'm going to put right sides together of the fabric. So those right sides go together, and just start at the top and circle around the entire face opening. We're just going to set these points in between and the layers and close up the seam right along the top of the head, right through the lining and the hat itself. So you'll want to just place your first point close to that transition. I wouldn't go too close, just because we want to have a little bit of fabric to round in underneath so that the black isn't poking out. So I'm just going to place that there, and then flip it around so that we create that loop or hole for the face and line up all 4 layers. What I'm going to do here when I stitch it is I'm going to lay the seam allowance in opposite directions. So one seam allowance is going to be laying towards the lining and the black, and the other seam allowance is going to be laying into the hat, just so that I don't have too much bulk all in one spot, but I do want the transition of colors to be at the same spot. So after I get this all lined up, I'm just going to place a pin in it since it's a lot of layers. I'm not going to attempt to sew this without any pins. And the other thing that I do also want to mention that I did was trim my seam allowance here for my points. You don't want there to be too much fabric from the indent where your point comes down to the edge of your seam allowance as it crests around the top of the hat. Otherwise, it's not going to lay very nicely when you flip it around. That's the same reason why we snip that seam allowance or notch the seam allowance at the bottom of the point, so that our seam allowance could turn nicely. We also don't want to have too much fabric on the outside of the hat. It doesn't really matter down at the bottom where it goes into the neck or right at the front, but along any types of curves, you're going to want to make sure that your seam allowance is not too long. So that is our dino points, and then I'm just going to throw a couple in the lining as well so that it stays together. This jersey that I'm using for the lining rolls along the cut edge, so I just want to get it kind of unrolled. So we're going to start at the bottom here at the lining and just go all the way across the top of the head, into the hat itself, and down the back of the neck on the other side. the top of the head closed and both the lining and the hat with our dinosaur points set in between the layers. And the last thing we need to do is just close this hem. So what I like to do is just flip it around. It's nice to double check what's happening and just see how things look. You might want to kind of press this edge so that it's nice and crisp and sharp. And what I'm also going to do is just round in this seam allowance right here in front of this first point and reach inside. Get in between my layers. Reach inside, and I'm just going to tack the seam allowance of the lining to the seam allowance of the hat, just right at the top. I don't want to go too far along because I want this seam to be nice and stretchy, and I'm just going to tack it with my lock stitch machine just right up here at the top. Now that it's tacked, you can immediately see how nice and sharp this top corner is and how that green is nicely rounded around the edge so that the lining stays inside. And then I'm just going to run down along this center back seam, make sure that it's all lined up, and then flip my seam allowances in towards each other so that I have right sides together. So this is how I want the hem to be finished when I'm done stitching it. So I can just reach inside and flip the toque around this way. I'm going to throw a pin in this just to keep everything lined up. We wouldn't want things to slide around. And then when I flip the hat back inside out, you can see we've created a loop once again. So we kind of have that loop going on. It gets a little tighter here because we've kind of brought in that center back seam towards each other. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch following this around, and I'll know that since I had it flipped right side out and the lining was inside the toque, I know it's going to be the right way around when I'm finished. Too often people will just stitch right sides together like this. It seems easier and seems like it's going to make sense when you're finished, but what happens here is if you've got that lining on the inside and you have those right sides together and stitch around the hem, is you can't turn it back right side out. So when you turn it around after you're finished hemming it all nicely, you're going to have this and you won't be able to get your head into it. So by flipping it the way we want it and double checking that we have our seam allowance lined up, then we can just kind of protect ourselves from making that mistake. If you're confident with linings and how things need to be, you can just go right ahead and line up your seam allowances like this and stitch it all the way around. I'm just going to throw in that one pin. You can put in more pins for sure if you need that extra guidance. So let's get this closed up. After stitching all the way around, I'm just going to chain off a little early. So this is just going to leave a little opening where I can flip the toque around. So let's see how this looks. I love this stretchy fabric because I can just leave a really, really small hole for turning. If you want, you can definitely stitch it closed, stitch the opening closed after you've turned it around by hand if you want it to be kind of a blind hole. I'm just gonna stitch straight over it with a regular lock stitch. So the regular straight stitch in my sewing machine is because it's much faster. I've got a thread that blends really nicely with this fabric. No one's gonna notice. Here we go. So as it's turning, it's also pulling the lining inside the hat. Here we go. So I just have this little opening, tuck that seam allowance in, and I'm just gonna close it up real quick. And voila! Now I have two dinosaur hats for my little guys. Hopefully they'll find these a little cooler. I did take a quick pit stop at my ironing board just to press the hem on the second one so that it's nice and sharp and that lining is nicely rolled in. And that brings us to the end of this week's Workshop Wednesday. Don't forget that the links are below for both the gnome hat PDF, so you can get yourself your pattern, whether you want to make this hat or the gnome hat, and also the link to my other video if you want to follow along with the gnome hat tutorial. Until next week, take care and happy sewing.